it's Reija and welcome to another video. Today I thought that I'd share with you my reading journey. So all the books that influenced me as a reader and helped shape me as a person. So I thought that I'd go through my childhood with you and share all the books that I really liked during those times and also explore some of the themes that I was interested in during those times. So let's just jump right in. So first up, of course, we must start from my baby years when I was a wee little kid, and back then I of course didn't know how to read, so I relied on other people to read for me. And during this time I heard a lot of stories from Hans Christian Andersen and Zachris Topelius, both of whom are very important storytellers in the Nordic area. Especially Snow Queen by Hans Christian Andersen really influenced me as a child, and it is still my all-time favorite fairy tale. My parents and my godparents also read a lot of Astrid Lindgren and Tove Jansson's books for me, and also I really enjoyed hearing stories by Beatrix Potter. And there was this TV show during my childhood that was on TV, and I watched all of the adventures of Peter Rabbit. And when we once visited the library and found out that there was a Finnish translation of Beatrix Potter's stories, we immediately borrowed it, and my mom read those stories for me as well. So my early childhood is influenced a lot by Nordic storytelling and fairy tales. And I have to say, even though as a child I also heard the Grimm fairy tales, I wasn't as keen on them as I was on Hans Christian Andersen's and Topelius's fairy tales. Next up, moving on to my elementary years, and this is the time that I learned how to read, when I was 7, and immediately when I learned how to read, I started bringing home library books. I would go to our library bus that would park on our schoolyard every Friday, and I would go and pick up at least 13 books, and I would take them home and read all of the books that I could, basically. And during this time, I started being really into mysteries. I liked the Nancy Drew series by Caroline Keene, which is a pseudonym for many ghostwriters that helped write the series. And I read probably most of those books. I think I read over 20 of them. I also read the famous 5 series by Enid Blyton, which was one of the series that my mom really liked, and she introduced it to me. Then I also read the Ghost Twin series by Diane Curtis Regan, and I really loved it because it had ghosts, and the mystery of how these children died and what happened to their family was a constant thread during the story. And they also solved mysteries for the living, which was really interesting, and I've always liked the premise of those books, and I really enjoyed them as a little kid. I also read all the books by Anni Svan. She was a Finnish author who wrote a lot of middle grade about the class divide in Finland, and she had a lot of like rags to riches sort of stories, and I really enjoyed those. They were mostly set in the countryside, and I lived in the countryside, so those books were really interesting to me and I really liked them. And finally, my number 1 book during this era was The Neverending Story by Michael Ende. And I love that book. It is still one of my all-time favorite books, and I think that is the book that got me interested in reading more fantasy-related stuff. Moving on to my teen years, and this is the start of my fantasy journey. I read a lot of fantasy and started being interested in sci-fi as well, and of course my teen years also marked the start of my interest in manga and anime and comics in general. This was the time I started reading Douglas Adams, David Eddings, Tad Williams, and I tried reading The Lord of the Rings during this time, but it didn't hold my interest. I was more keen on finding things that had a lot of action and adventure and weren't really all that subtle, so to speak. I think David Eddings and Tad Williams were kind of my gateway into exploring more nuanced fantasy. At this time I also read The Watership Down by Richard Adams and The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams. And Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy was a kind of gateway to sci-fi for me because it is a very light story with a lot of emphasis on humor, so it is easy to absorb and easy to get into. And after Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, I got into the likes of Isaac Asimov and Alastair Reynolds. Of course, my teen years were also a time of Harry Potter. I started reading Harry Potter when I was, I think, around 8th grade or so. And it's actually a funny story because my mom was a part of this book club. She had a subscription box come in every month and she forgot to cancel her order, and that month's order was Harry Potter. And it came in and my mom was like, okay, I don't want to return it. And she gave it to me and I read it and I fell in love with Harry Potter and had to get all the books thereafter. During my high school years, I got into Johanna Sinisalo's books and George R.R. Martin, whom you've heard me talk a lot about on this channel. Next up, moving on to my early 20s or my young adult era. And this was a time for me when I was really trying to find myself, trying to come to terms with my identity and my sexual orientation. So I pretty much exclusively read books and comics which had LGBTQ plus characters in them. I became obsessed with reading about same-sex romances or same-sex relationships. So those were the books that I was looking for and I was interested in during this time. And I got into Ellen Kushner's work during this time, so I read all of her Riverside series, and also Sarah Monette with her Doctrine of Labyrinth series, and Elizabeth Bear with her Promethean Age series. All of these series have characters who are LGBT characters. And later on, as I finally came to terms with who I really am and what I represent and what I want to represent, I started reading a bit more diversely again and I started exploring other kinds of storytelling. So that's when I started becoming interested in authors such as Scott Lynch and Gail Carriger. And I've talked previously a lot about Lies of Locke Lamora, and so I won't go into much detail here, but that book really came at a right time in my life. I really loved it then and I love it now. And it has been a very influential read for me. So yeah, my early 20s were mostly about reading a lot of fantasy and reading a lot of queer lit. So now we have come to the present. So what kind of books interest me the most right now? I'm really into new kinds of high fantasy series right now. Something like The Dandelion Dynasty by Ken Liu or the Broken Earth trilogy by N.K. Jemisin. I want authors to explore new themes and new worlds that are not always inspired by the Western ideals and Western settings. I'm also always into reading about queer characters. I have also started rereading a lot of classics. Like, I have read classics before, but they didn't really grab me in the same way that they do now, because I think I have finally come to the point in my life where I can appreciate the themes and the writing in older works. So I've been picking up on Jane Austen and George Orwell, and also Oscar Wilde. So I think the main theme right now for me is to read diverse books and to read classics. That is kind of my current reading goal. So this has been my reading journey. I hope you liked this video. If you did, consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. And I'm also really interested in your reading journeys, so if you want to do a video or a blog post about this, then please do and send a link my way and I will be sure to check them out. And I will see you in the next video. Bye!